I'm Sarah Mitchell, 32, a high school English teacher from Denver, Colorado. 9 months pregnant with our first child, I was organizing our digital photos for the baby album when I accidentally opened my husband's laptop. What I found shattered. My world, his dating profile, was not only still active, but he'd been messaging other women throughout my entire pregnancy. The betrayal cut deeper than labor pains ever could. As I sat there, my unborn daughter kicking inside me, I realized this wasn't just about infidelity. The messages revealed a web of lies about our finances, our future, and the life I thought we were building together. What I discovered next would change everything, not just for me and my baby, but for every woman who's ever trusted the wrong man. Sometimes the most devastating betrayals lead to the most powerful transformations. If you've ever felt your world crumble at the worst possible moment, subscribe for a story of strength, justice, and finding your voice when everything falls apart. I should have known something was wrong when David stopped looking at me the way he used to. But when you're carrying your first child, you tell yourself that the distance is normal, that men sometimes struggle with the reality of impending fatherhood. You make excuses because love makes you blind to the truth staring you in the face. Met David Mitchell 3 years ago at a coffee shop near my high school in Denver. I was grading papers, red pen, bleeding across essays about Romeo and Juliet, when this charming man with perfectly styled hair and an expensive suit asked if he could share my table. He was a real estate agent, he said, successful enough to afford the designer clothes and confident smile that drew me in immediately. "You're beautiful when you're concentrating," he'd said, watching me mark up another student's confused analysis of star-crossed lovers. The irony wasn't lost on me later. Our courtship was a whirlwind of romantic dinners at Denver's finest restaurants, weekend trips to Aspen, and thoughtful gifts that showed he was really listening. When I mentioned loving sunflowers, he surprised me with a field trip to a sunflower farm in Brighton. When I complained about my old car breaking down, he helped me find a reliable used Honda that fit my teacher's budget. David proposed on the peak of Mount Evans during a hiking trip. The ring, sparkling against the backdrop of the Rocky Mountains. The photo from that day sits on our mantle, both of us glowing with happiness and possibility. I was 29, he was 33, and we felt like we had the whole world ahead of us, thought the wedding was everything. I dreamed of a small ceremony at the Denver Botanic Gardens, surrounded by family and friends. My sister Katie was my maid of honor, and she whispered in my ear as we posed for photos, "You deserve this happiness, Sarah. You deserve everything." Looking back at our wedding album now, I can see what I missed then. In every photo, David's smile seems just a little too practiced, his eyes scanning the crowd instead of focused on me. But I was so swept up in the fairy tale that I didn't notice the signs of a man who was already looking for his next adventure. The first year of marriage was blissful. We bought a beautiful 2-story home in Highlands Ranch, complete with a garden where I could grow the vegetables I'd always wanted. David's real estate business was thriving, and I was happy teaching sophomore English at Cherry Creek High School. We talked about starting a family, about the children who would play in our backyard, about growing old together in the house we'd made our own. When I got pregnant last year, David seemed excited. He held me close and whispered about how our baby would be the most beautiful child in the world, a perfect combination of both of us. He went to the first few doctor's appointments, his hand warm on my back as we listened to the heartbeat for the first time. But as my belly grew, David seemed to shrink away. He started working longer hours, taking weekend appointments that kept him away from home. When I asked him to help set up the nursery, he'd promise to do it tomorrow, then disappear for hours, claiming he had to show houses to demanding clients. I told myself it was the stress of becoming a father. I told myself he was working extra hard to provide for a growing family. I told myself that the way he flinched when I reached for his hand was just fatigue, not revulsion. Love makes you a liar, especially to yourself. The moment I saw that, Dating profile, time stopped. My pregnant belly pressed against the edge of David's desk as I stared at the screen, my heart hammering so hard I was afraid it might disturb the baby. There was my husband's face, smiling that same charming smile that had won me over 3 years ago. But now it felt like a mask hiding something sinister. His profile was recent updated just 2 days ago. The photos were ones I'd never seen before, taken in clothes I didn't recognize, in places I'd never been. One showed him at a restaurant downtown, the kind of upscale place he used to take me to when we were dating. Another was a professional-looking headshot that must have cost hundreds of dollars. When had he had time for a photo shoot? My hands shook as I scrolled through his profile. Under About Me, he'd written, "Successful real estate entrepreneur, looking for someone who shares my passion for adventure, love fine dining, weekend getaways, and deep conversations. Ready to explore what life has to offer with the right person." There was no mention of a wife, no mention of a baby on the way. I didn't exist in his carefully crafted online persona. I knew I had to act fast. David had gone to show a house in Lakewood and wouldn't be back for at least 2 hours, but I couldn't risk him walking in on me. My fingers moved quickly across the keyboard, taking screenshots of everything: his profile, his photos, his activity status that showed he'd been online that very morning. The dating app had a messaging feature, and that's where I found the real devastation. Dozens of conversations with different women, some dating back months, others from just days ago. My vision blurred as I read through them, but I forced myself to document everything. "Hey beautiful, can't wait to see you tonight," he'd written to someone named Jessica just last week. Last week, when I'd spent the evening alone eating ice cream and watching Netflix because he claimed he was working late on a difficult sale. "You're so much more interesting than most women I meet," he told a blonde named Amanda. Finally, someone who gets my sense of humor. I'd always thought I was the one who got his sense of humor. I'd always been the one laughing at his jokes, encouraging his dreams, supporting his ambitions. But the worst message was to a woman named Crystal. "My situation is complicated right now, but it won't be for much longer. I'm working on making some changes that will free me up to focus on what really matters. What situation, what changes." The baby and I were a situation to be managed, not a family to be cherished. I grabbed my phone and started photographing the screen, making sure to capture timestamps and usernames. Then I dug deeper, checking his browser history, his saved passwords, his photo albums. That's when I found the other apps: Tinder, Bumble, Match.com. He had accounts on all of them, each with slightly different photos, but the same deceptive message: "Available, single, ready to mingle." My phone buzzed with a text from David, showing running late. "Don't wait up. Love you. Love you." The words that used to make my heart flutter now felt like poison. How could someone claim to love you while simultaneously advertising themselves as available to other women? How could someone promise to cherish you while planning their escape? I kept digging, driven by a mixture of rage and desperate need to understand. In his email, I found confirmations for restaurant reservations I'd never been to, receipts for flowers I'd never received, and confirmation numbers for weekend trips I'd never taken. While I was at home growing heavy with his child, dealing with morning sickness and swollen feet, he was living a completely different life. The bank statements were the final piece of the puzzle. David had been meticulous about hiding his paper trail, but he'd gotten careless with his digital footprint. I found charges for expensive dinners, luxury hotels, jewelry purchases from stores I'd never been to. While I was clipping coupons and worrying about the cost of baby supplies, he was spending thousands on other women. I printed everything, every message, every photo, every receipt. The printer hummed steadily as it churned out page after page of evidence, each sheet another nail in the coffin of our marriage. By the time I was done, I had a stack of papers 3 inches thick, But even as I gathered this devastating evidence, part of me kept hoping there was some explanation. Maybe it was all a misunderstanding. Maybe he'd forgotten to delete old profiles. Maybe those messages were from before we were married. Then I saw the timestamp on his most recent message to Jessica. Can't wait to hold you again. Missing you already. Sent yesterday at 2:47 p.m. Yesterday, when he'd come home and kissed my forehead, asked about my day, and rubbed my feet while we watched TV. That's when I knew there was no going back. The David the first thought I'd married didn't exist. The man I'd been sharing a bed with, making a baby with, planning a future with, was a stranger, a liar, a cheat, and I was about to become a mother. Reading through David's messages felt like watching my marriage die in real time. Each conversation was a small betrayal, but together they painted a picture of a man who had never truly committed to me at all. I made myself read every single one, no matter how much it hurt, because I needed to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. Jessica seemed to be his primary target. Their conversation thread went back 4 months, right around the time I'd started showing. She was a marketing executive, divorced, no kids. In her profile picture, she had the kind of effortless beauty that comes from expensive skincare and regular gym sessions. Everything I felt I'd lost as my body changed with pregnancy. You make me feel alive again, David had written to her. I forgot what it was like to be with someone who actually wants to be with me. I had to stop reading for a moment. What did that mean? I'd always wanted to be with him. I'd supported his career, laughed at his jokes, made our house a home. How was that not wanting to be with him? The messages with Jessica were frequent and intimate. They'd been on at least 6 dates that I could count, including a weekend trip to Vail that he'd told me was a real estate conference. The photos he'd sent her from that trip showed him relaxing by a fireplace, holding a glass of wine, looking happier than I'd seen him in months. Wish you were here to share this with me, he'd written, attaching a photo of a romantic dinner for 2. While I was at home 7 months pregnant, eating leftover pizza and grading papers, he was playing house with another woman, but Jessica wasn't the only one. Amanda was a fitness instructor who seemed to bring out David's adventurous side. They'd gone hiking together, rock climbing, to concerts downtown. All the activities he'd stopped doing with me once I got pregnant, claiming he was too busy or too tired. You're so different from other women, he'd told Amanda. You don't need constant attention or validation. You're independent. I'd always been independent. I'd had my own career, my own interests, my own life before David, but pregnancy had made me need him more. Need his support and partnership as we prepared for our child. Apparently, that neediness had been a turn-off rather than a natural part of our relationship evolving. Then there was Crystal, a nurse who worked night shifts. Their conversations were more sexual in nature, filled with promises of what they'd do together when they finally met in person. She lived in Colorado Springs, about an hour away, which explained some of David's mysterious weekend disappearances. I can't wait to show you how much I've missed you, he'd written to her just last week. My life has been so stressful lately, but thinking about you gets me through it. I was the stress in his life. Our baby was the stress in his life. The family we'd created together was something he needed to escape from, not something he was excited to build. The restaurant receipts the first found told their own story. Expensive dinners at places like the Capitol Grill, Guard and Grace, root down all restaurants we talked about trying together but never seemed to have the money for. Or rather, we didn't have the money because he was spending it on other. Women.1 receipt particularly stung, a $347 dinner for 2 at Mercantile. Dining and provision on the same night, I'd asked him to pick up groceries on his way home. He'd said he didn't have cash for groceries, that we needed to wait until his next commission check. Meanwhile, he was spending more on one dinner than I spent on groceries in a month. The gifts were another revelation. Jewelry receipts from high-end stores in Cherry Creek, flower deliveries to addresses I didn't recognize, even a spa package for someone named Michelle that cost more than I made in a week of teaching. I thought about all the times I'd suggested we do something special together. How he'd always had an excuse. Money's tight right now, he'd say. Let's wait until after the baby comes. But money apparently wasn't too tight for his extracurricular activities. The cruelest part was how he'd complained about me to these women. In his messages to Jessica, he painted me as needy and emotional, someone who didn't understand the pressures of his work. To Amanda, he had described me as clingy and demanding. To Crystal, I was the obstacle keeping him from living his best life. She doesn't get that I need space to be myself, he'd written to one of them. Everything is always about her needs, her feelings, her schedule. I'd never thought of myself as demanding. I'd ask for help with the nursery, support during difficult pregnancy symptoms, and his presence at doctor's appointments. I'd wanted him to be excited about our baby, to plan for our future together. Apparently, those were unreasonable expectations, but perhaps the most devastating discovery was in his messages to a woman named Sophia. She was asking about his availability for a weekend trip to Aspen, and his response chilled me to the bone. I should be free soon. I'm dealing with some loose ends at home, but those will be tied up after the baby comes. Then I can focus on what really matters. I was a loose end. Our child was a loose end, something to be dealt with and discarded. So he could move on to his real life. I sat back in his chair, my hand instinctively moving to my belly where our daughter was kicking. She seemed to sense my distress, moving restlessly as if she knew something was wrong. I whispered to her, "It's okay, baby girl. Mommy's going to take care of everything." Because that's what I realized in that moment. I was going to be a mother soon, and my job was to protect my child from the kind of man who could betray his family so casually. David had already shown me who he was. I just needed to believe him. The dating profiles and messages were devastating, but what I found in our financial records was what truly opened my eyes to the depth of David's deception. As I dug deeper into his digital footprint, I discovered that the man I'd married wasn't just unfaithful. He was a financial predator who'd been systematically stealing from our family's future daughter joint checking account, which I'd been watching carefully to save for baby expenses, showed a balance much lower than I'd expected. I'd been contributing my teacher's salary faithfully, and David claimed his real estate commissions were strong. But somehow we never seemed to have enough money for the things we needed. Now I knew why. I pulled up our bank statements for the past 6 months, and the pattern became clear. Regular transfers to accounts I didn't recognize, cash withdrawals far exceeding our normal spending, and credit card payments to cards I didn't know existed. David had been living a double life. Financially, just as he had been romantically, the secret credit cards were the first shock. I found statements for 3 different cards, all in his name only, with balances totaling over $35,000. The charges read like a playbook for modern infidelity, expensive restaurants, luxury hotels, jewelry stores, spa treatments, and retail purchases at stores I'd never been to. One card showed a $2,800 charge to Tiffany & Co. from 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, when I'd been complaining about not having a proper diaper bag, and he'd told me we needed to be more careful with money. He bought someone else a Tiffany bracelet while telling his pregnant wife she couldn't afford a $150 diaper. Backed out another card showed regular charges to a high-end apartment complex in downtown Denver. Monthly payments of $1,500 that had been going on for 4 months. David was paying for someone else's apartment while I worried about whether we could afford the mortgage on our own home, but the most devastating discovery was what had happened to our savings account. The account we'd been building for the baby's future, for my maternity leave, for the security of our growing family. The balance showed $3,247. It should have shown $23,000, nearly $20,000, had been transferred out over the past 5 months in chunks of $2,000 to $4,000 at a time, just small enough to avoid triggering automatic alerts, but large enough to fund David's secret lifestyle. I traced the money to a personal account I'd never seen before, one that showed regular transfers to his various girlfriends and expensive purchases for his double life. I felt sick. While I'd been carefully budgeting for maternity leave, calculating how we'd manage on reduced income, David had been spending our baby's college fund on other women, while I'd been clipping coupons and shopping sales to prepare for our daughter's arrival. He'd been buying jewelry for women who didn't even know I existed. The real estate documents I found were perhaps the most shocking revelation. David hadn't just been spending our money, he'd been making investments without telling me. Investments that had nothing to do with our family's future. 3 months ago, he'd purchased a condo in Boulder for $185,000. The down payment had come from a business account I didn't know existed, one that showed he'd been hiding real estate commissions from me for over a year. According to the rental agreement I found, the condo was being leased to Jessica, the same Jessica from his dating profile. He'd bought his girlfriend a place to live while telling me we couldn't afford to renovate the nursery. I also found paperwork for a vacation property in Winter Park, purchased under an LLC he'd created without my knowledge. The mortgage payments were being made from the same secret account, and the property management company had instructions to rent it out to preferred clients only. David had been building a real estate empire behind my back, using money that should have been securing our family's future. He'd used our joint credit, our shared resources, and his access to our accounts to fund a lifestyle that had nothing to do with me or our baby Dot. The investment statements were another punch to the gut. We talked about opening a 529 education savings plan for our daughter, but David had always said we should wait until after she was born to start saving. Meanwhile, he'd been investing thousands in cryptocurrency and high-risk stocks, gambling with money that should have been going toward our family's stability. I found receipts for a $15,000 investment in some kind of tech startup made just 2 months ago. 2 months ago, when I'd asked him about getting a bigger car to accommodate the car seat, and he'd said we couldn't afford the payments. The pattern was clear. David had been living like a single man with disposable income while maintaining the facade of a struggling married couple. He had been telling me we needed to be careful with money while simultaneously spending thousands on other women and secret investments. I printed everything, every bank statement, every credit card bill, every investment document. The pile of evidence grew higher and higher, a mountain of proof that the man I'd married had been stealing from our family before our family had even officially begun. But what hurt most wasn't just the money, it was the betrayal of trust. I believed him when he said we needed to be conservative with our spending. I'd worried about taking time off work, about being able to afford childcare, about providing for our daughter's future. I denied myself simple pleasures and necessities because I thought we were struggling financially. We weren't struggling. I was struggling because David had been systematically moving our resources to fund his secret life. As I sat there surrounded by evidence of his financial infidelity, I realized that this wasn't just about being unfaithful, it was about David. Seeing me and our baby as obstacles to his real life, inconveniences to be managed rather than family to be cherished. The baby kicked hard, as if she sensed my distress. I placed my hand on my belly and whispered, "Don't worry, sweetheart. Mommy's going to make sure you're taken care of. He might have stolen from us, but he's not going to get away with it." For the first time since discovering David's betrayal, I felt something stronger than heartbreak. I felt determination. The contractions started at 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday morning. 3 days after I discovered David's secret life. I'd been lying awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing through everything I'd learned about my husband's betrayal. The sharp pain that shot through my belly was almost a relief. At least physical pain was something I could understand and manage. I timed the contractions for an hour, watching the clock on my phone while David slept peacefully beside me. When they reached 5 minutes apart, I knew it was time. I gently shook his shoulder. "David, wake up. The baby's coming." He stirred gradually, checking his phone. "Are you sure?" "Maybe it's just false labor." "Unsure." "The contractions are regular and getting stronger." He sat up, running his hands through his hair. "Okay, let me take a shower first. Then we'll head to the hospital." A shower? I was in labor with his child and he wanted to take a shower? But I didn't argue. I was too focused on breathing through the increasingly intense contractions to fight. About his priorities. By the time David emerged from the bathroom, hair perfectly styled and cologne applied, I was pacing the bedroom, gripping the dresser. Each time a contraction hit, he grabbed his phone and started typing furiously. "Who are you texting?" I asked between contractions. "Just letting my office know I'll be out today," he said, not looking up from his phone, but I'd seen his screen. He wasn't texting his office. He was texting Jessica. "Something came up. Have to cancel tonight. Rain check." My husband was canceling a date with his girlfriend because his wife was in labor. The casualness of it, the way he treated our baby's birth as an inconvenience that interfered with his real plans, made me angrier than the contractions made me. Hurt. We drove to Presbyterian St. Joseph Hospital in tense silence. David kept checking his phone at red lights, and I could see the notifications lighting up his screen. Messages from Jessica, from Amanda, from women whose names I'd memorized over the past few days. Even now, as I labored to bring his child into the world, he couldn't disconnect from his secret life. The hospital staff was wonderful, efficient and kind as they got me checked in and settled into a labor room. The contractions were coming harder now, and I focused on the breathing techniques from our childbirth class, the class David had attended while simultaneously planning dates with other women. "I need to make a few calls," David said once I was settled in the hospital bed. "Some client emergencies? Can't they wait? I'm in labor." "It'll just be a few minutes. I'll be right back." He stepped out into the hallway, phone already pressed to his ear. Through the partially open door, I could hear fragments of his conversation. "No, I can't meet tonight, ... Stuck at the hospital, ... Yeah, it's complicated, ... My sister Katie arrived an hour later, rushing into the room with flowers and a concerned expression. "How are you holding up?" "Where's David?" "He's making calls," I said, gripping her hand as another contraction peaked. Katie's face darkened. "He's making calls? You're in labor." "It's fine," I lied. Because what was the point of explaining that my husband was probably reassuring his girlfriends that this inconvenient birth wouldn't affect his availability for long? David returned just as the doctor came in to check my progress. "You're at 6 centimeters, Dr. Martinez announced. Things are moving along nicely. We should have a baby in the next few hours." "Great," David said, but he was looking at his phone again. The screen showed he'd missed several calls from Jessica. "David, can you put the phone away, please?" I asked, embarrassed to have to make this request in front of the medical staff. "Sorry, just work stuff." He slipped the phone into his pocket, but I could see him fighting the urge to check it. The pain intensified over the next few hours, and I found myself leaning more and more on Katie for support. She held my hand, rubbed my back, and whispered encouragement while David sat in the corner chair, occasionally glancing up from his phone to ask if I needed anything. During one particularly intense contraction, I reached for David's hand. "I need you," I gasped at. He squeezed my hand briefly, then let go to answer his buzzing phone. "I have to take this," he said, stepping back into the hallway. Katie's eyes blazed with anger. "Sarah, What is wrong with him? I couldn't tell her the truth that David was managing his dating life while I labored to deliver a child. That he was more concerned about disappointing his girlfriends than supporting his wife. That the man I'd married had checked out of our relationship so completely that even the birth of his daughter couldn't hold his attention. When it came time to push, David was back in the room, but he might as well have been a stranger. He held my hand when the nurse insisted, said the right words when prompted, but his heart wasn't there. Even as our daughter crowned, even as Dr. Martinez announced that she was almost here, David seemed like he was going through the motions rather than experiencing the miracle of his child's birth. Emma Rose Mitchell entered the world at 4:17 p.m., screaming and perfect. The moment the doctor placed her on my chest, I fell completely and irrevocably in love. This tiny person with her wrinkled red face and delicate fingers was mine. She was perfect and innocent and deserved so much better than the situation she'd been born into. She's beautiful, David said, and for a moment I thought maybe this would change everything. Maybe seeing his daughter would remind him of what truly mattered. But as the nurses cleaned Emma and performed their initial checks, David's phone buzzed again. I watched him glance at it, then type a quick response. While his daughter was taking her first breaths, he was texting another woman. The nurse handed Emma back to me, and I cradled her close, breathing in her sweet baby smell. "Hi, sweetheart," I whispered. "I'm your mommy, and I'm going to take care of you always." Katie was crying, overcome with emotion at meeting her new niece. "She's perfect, Sarah, absolutely perfect." David took a few photos with his phone, probably for social media, then excused himself to make more calls. "I need to update everyone," he said. "Let people know she's here." But I knew he wasn't calling our families or friends. He was managing his other relationships, probably explaining why he'd been unavailable, reassuring his girlfriends that this was just a temporary disruption to his real life. As I held Emma, still exhausted from labor but filled with fierce protective love, I made a silent promise to my daughter. She would never wonder if she was wanted. She would never question her worth or compete for attention that should be freely given. She would grow up knowing that she was loved completely and unconditionally, unlike her father. I would never see her as an inconvenience or an obstacle to my happiness. She was my happiness, my purpose, my future. The nurse handed me a bracelet with Emma's information, her weight, length, time of birth. Such a simple thing, but it represented everything David had missed by being emotionally absent. This little bracelet was proof that I had done this, that I had brought our daughter safely into the world while he had been focused on everything except what truly mattered. Looking at Emma's peaceful face, I knew that whatever came next, she and I would face it together. We were a team now, and I would do whatever it took to protect her from the kind of man who could betray his family without a second thought. The first week home with Emma was a blur of sleepless nights, feeding schedules, and the overwhelming love that comes with new motherhood. But it was also when David's true priorities became impossible to ignore. While I was learning to navigate the challenges of caring for a newborn, he was finding every excuse to avoid the responsibility of being a father. Emma was a good baby, but she was still a baby. She needed to eat every 2 hours, her sleep was unpredictable, and she required constant attention. I'd expected the adjustment to be difficult, but I'd also expected to have a partner helping me through it. Instead, I found myself essentially single parenting while David continued his double life. The first night home, Emma woke crying at 2 a.m. I was still recovering from childbirth, exhausted and sore, but I struggled out of bed to feed her. David didn't even stir. When she woke again at 4 a.m., I gently shook his shoulder. "Can you take this one? I just fed her 2 hours ago." He groaned and rolled over. "I have an early showing tomorrow. I need my sleep." It was the first of many early showings, client emergencies, and work obligations that would keep David away from the reality of new parenthood. By the end of the week, I'd given up expecting help during the night. It was easier to handle Emma's needs myself than to fight with him about sharing the responsibility. During the day, David's absence was even more pronounced. He'd leave early for work and return late, always with stories about demanding clients and complicated deals. But I'd learned to read the signs of his deception. The lingering smell of perfume that wasn't mine, the way he immediately showered when he got home, the secretive way he handled his phone. "How was your day?" I asked one evening as he walked through the door at 9 p.m. "Long, really difficult client. You know how it is." But I'd seen the charge on our credit card statement that morning dinner for two at a restaurant downtown, right around the time he claimed to be showing houses. While I'd been home with Emma, surviving on leftover takeout and whatever I could grab between feedings, David had been enjoying fine dining with one of his girlfriends. What hurt most was his complete lack of interest in Emma. When friends and family came to visit, he'd pick her up for photos and say all the right things about how beautiful she was, how proud he was to be her father. But when it was just the three of us, he treated her like an inconvenience. "Why is she crying so much?" He'd ask when Emma fussed during her evening feeding. "She's a baby, David. Babies cry. Can't you do something about it?" "I'm trying to watch the game." He never offered to help with diaper changes, never volunteered for feedings, never suggested taking her for a walk so I could rest. When Emma had her first doctor's appointment, he claimed he had a closing he couldn't miss. When she needed her newborn photos taken, he was conveniently called away for a work emergency. The breaking point came when Emma was 5 days old. I'd been struggling with breastfeeding, and she'd been crying for hours despite my best efforts to comfort her. I was exhausted, emotional, and desperately needed support. David was in the living room, supposedly working on his laptop, but I could see he was actually scrolling through social media. "David, I need help," I called out, bouncing Emma gently as she continued to cry. "I think something might be wrong. She won't eat and she won't stop crying." "You're the one with the maternal instincts," he called back. "You'll figure it out." Maternal instincts. As if being a mother came with some magical handbook that made everything obvious. As if the overwhelming responsibility of keeping a tiny human alive and healthy was something I should just naturally know how to handle. Managed to calm Emma down eventually. She just needed a different feeding position, but David's dismissal stung. This was supposed to be our baby, our shared responsibility, our joint adventure into parenthood. Instead, I felt like a single mother who happened to share a house with an indifferent roommate. The worst part was watching how easily he lied to everyone else about his involvement. When his mother called to check on us, I listened to him describe sleepless nights he'd never experienced and feeding schedules he'd never participated in. "Oh, you know how it is, Mom. We're both pretty tired, but Sarah's doing great and Emma is perfect. I'm trying to help as much as I can, but work has been crazy." When my mother visited, he made sure to be holding Emma when she arrived, playing the devoted father role to perfection. He'd coo over her, talk about how much he loved being a dad, and accept congratulations on what a beautiful family we made. The moment my mother left, he'd hand Emma back to me and disappear into his home office. I started taking pictures during those early days, not the post. Perfect family photos David preferred, but real moments. Emma sleeping peacefully in her crib, her tiny hand wrapped around my finger during a midnight feeding. The exhausted but content expression on my face after successfully soothing her to sleep. These photos became precious to me because they told the truth of our story. They showed a mother and daughter learning to navigate the world together without any help from the man who should have been our partner in this journey. One evening, I found David packing a small suitcase in our bedroom. "Where are you going?" I asked Emma, sleeping against my shoulder after her evening feeding. Denver has a real estate conference this weekend. Great networking opportunity. I'd learned not to believe his excuses, but I was too tired to fight. When will you be back? Sunday evening, probably late. Emma was 8 days old, and he was going to leave us alone for an entire weekend. I thought about the charges I'd seen on his credit cards, the hotel reservations that didn't match his supposed business trips, the way he'd been increasingly eager to find reasons to be away from home. David, I just had a baby. I'm still recovering. Don't you think, Sarah, this is important for my career? For our family's future, you'll be fine. Babies mostly just sleep anyway. Babies mostly just sleep? It was clear he'd never spent more than a few minutes alone with Emma, or he'd know that newborns required constant attention and care. After he left Friday morning, I felt something I hadn't expected. Relief. It was easier to care for Emma alone than to manage her needs while also dealing with David's selfishness and emotional absence. At least now I didn't have to pretend we were a happy family or make excuses for his behavior. Katie came over Saturday afternoon to help, bringing groceries and her own fierce anger at David's absence. A real estate conference? She said, holding Emma while I took my first shower in 2 days. Sarah, you just had a baby. He should be here. I know, I said, too tired to defend him anymore. This isn't normal. New fathers don't just disappear for weekends when their babies are barely a week old. I knew she was right, but admitting it out loud felt like acknowledging that my marriage was over before Emma's life had really begun. I wasn't ready for that conversation yet, even though the evidence was mounting that David had already made his choice about what mattered to him. That weekend alone with Emma, I realized something important. I was a good mother. Without David's negativity and indifference, I could focus completely on my daughter's needs. I could trust my instincts, celebrate small victories, and find joy in the simple moments of new parenthood. I took Emma's first real portrait that Sunday, just the two of us curled up on the couch in the afternoon sunlight. She was wearing the tiny pink dress my mother had brought, and her eyes were open, alert and curious about the world around her. In that photo, we both looked peaceful and content, two people who belonged together, complete without needing anyone else. When David returned Sunday night, he barely glanced at Emma before heading straight to his laptop to catch up on work. I didn't bother telling him about her first smile or how well she'd slept Saturday night. He'd made it clear that the details of our daughter's life weren't important to him, but they were important to me, and they always would be. When Emma was 2 weeks old, while she napped peacefully in her bassinet, I decided it was time to dig deeper into David's financial deceptions. I'd been putting off a thorough investigation, overwhelmed by the demands of new motherhood. But I couldn't ignore what I'd discovered much longer. Emma deserved a secure future, and I needed to understand exactly what David had done with our resources. What I found was worse than I'd imagined. I started with the real estate records, using the online database access that came with David's professional license. The Boulder condo I'd already discovered was just the beginning. Over the past 18 months, David had been quietly building a property portfolio that I knew nothing about. The Winter Park vacation rental was registered under an LLC called Mountain Vista Properties, with David as the sole owner. But there was also a duplex in Arvada, purchased 8 months ago, and a small commercial building in Wheat Ridge that he'd bought just after I got pregnant. All told, he had invested over $600,000 in real estate without my knowledge, using our joint credit and hidden income to finance his empire. The most infuriating discovery was the Boulder condo where Jessica lived. Not only had David bought it, but he was charging her below market rent, essentially subsidizing his girlfriend's housing while I worried about whether we could afford our mortgage payments. The rent she paid didn't even cover the monthly mortgage, which meant David was losing money on the property. every month just to keep her comfortable, but the property purchases were just part of the pattern. David had been systematically hiding income from his real estate business, maintaining separate accounts that I'd never seen. His commission checks went into a business account that he controlled exclusively, and he'd been transferring only a portion of his earnings to our joint account. I found tax documents that showed his actual income was nearly double what he'd been telling me. Last year, when I'd been carefully budgeting every dollar of my teaching salary and worried about taking unpaid maternity leave, David had earned over $180,000, yet our joint account had only seen about $90,000 of that income. Where had the rest gone? Into his secret properties, his dating expenses, and something even more shocking, a second life insurance policy that I'd never heard of. The beneficiary wasn't me or Emma, it was someone named Crystal Morrison. The same Crystal from his dating apps, the nurse from Colorado Springs. David had taken out a $500,000 life insurance policy and named his girlfriend as the beneficiary. While I'd been carrying his child, he'd been planning for a future where I didn't exist. The investment accounts told their own disturbing story. David had been using our joint savings to fund high-risk cryptocurrency investments and day trading activities. The $20,000 that had disappeared from our baby savings hadn't just been spent, it had been gambled away in volatile investments that he'd hidden from me. Most of the cryptocurrency investments had lost money, but David kept throwing more cash at them, apparently convinced he could make back his losses. Meanwhile, he'd been telling me we couldn't afford basic baby items because money was tight. I found records of margin trading accounts where David had borrowed against our home's equity to fund even more speculative investments. He'd put our house at risk without my knowledge or consent, gambling with the roof over our heads while I was pregnant with his child. The credit card statements revealed the full scope of his deception. Beyond the cards I'd already discovered, there were two more, both maxed out. The charges painted a picture of a man living like a wealthy bachelor, expensive clothes, electronics, weekend trips, and constant dining out at high-end restaurants. One card showed a $3,000 charge to a jewelry store in Cherry Creek, made just 2 weeks before Emma was born. While I'd been in my final weeks of pregnancy, uncomfortable and preparing for labor, David had been buying expensive gifts for other women, but perhaps the most devastating discovery was in his email correspondence with a real estate attorney. David had been quietly exploring options for divorce, specifically asking about how to protect his assets and minimize his financial obligations to a spouse and child. The email thread, dating back 4 months, showed David's true intentions. I need to understand my options for protecting business assets in the event of a divorce. My wife doesn't work in real estate and wasn't involved in building the business. What can I do to ensure she doesn't get half of everything I've worked for? The attorney's responses were equally chilling, outlining strategies for hiding assets, undervaluing properties, and minimizing alimony and child support obligations. They discussed the timing of a divorce filing, with the attorney suggesting that David wait until after the baby was born to avoid appearing heartless. David had been planning to leave me all along. The pregnancy, the marriage, the home we'd built together, it had all been a facade while he prepared his exit strategy. Emma and I weren't his family. We were obstacles to be managed and minimized. I printed everything, creating a comprehensive file of David's financial betrayals: property, deeds, bank statements, investment records, credit card bills, insurance policies, and legal correspondence. The evidence filled 2 thick binders, a paper trail of deception that stretched back over a year. As I organized the documents, I realized that David's behavior made perfect sense now. He'd been distant during my pregnancy because he was already emotionally divorced from our marriage. He'd been uninterested in baby preparations because he didn't plan to be around for Emma's childhood. He'd been working longer hours not to provide for his family, but to build assets he could take with him when he left. The man I'd married, the man I'd trusted with my heart and my future, had been systematically stealing from me while planning his escape. He'd used my love and trust against me, taking advantage of my pregnancy to hide his activities when I was too vulnerable and distracted to notice. But David had made one crucial mistake. He'd underestimated me. He had assumed that a small-town teacher wouldn't understand complex financial arrangements or know how to investigate his deceptions. He'd counted on my trust and naivety to keep his secrets safe. He was wrong, as I sat surrounded by evidence of his betrayal. Holding Emma close as she slept, I felt my sadness transforming into something more powerful, determination. David thought he could use and discard us, but he had no idea who he was really dealing with. I was Emma's mother, and I would fight for her future with everything I had. David's carefully constructed web of lies was about to unravel, and I was going to be the one pulling the strings. The paper trail he'd created in his arrogance would become the evidence that ensured Emma and I got the justice we deserved. When Emma was 3 weeks old, I made the call that would change everything. While David was supposedly at work, though I suspected he was really with one of his girlfriends, I contacted Margaret Chen, a family law attorney whose name I'd found through the Colorado Bar Association website. I need to understand my options, I told her during our initial phone consultation. I've discovered that my husband has been hiding assets and having affairs, and I need to know how to protect my newborn daughter and myself. Margaret's voice was warm but professional. I'm sorry you're going through this, especially with a new baby. Can you come in this week? Bring whatever documentation you have. I arranged for Katie to watch Emma, and 3 days later, I sat in Margaret's downtown Denver office with my 2 thick binders of evidence. Margaret was in her 50s, with kind eyes and the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd seen every kind of marital betrayal imaginable. This is quite comprehensive, she said, flipping through the financial documents. How did you gather all of this? He left his laptop open one day, and I started investigating. I'm a teacher, I know how to research. Margaret nodded approvingly. Good instincts. Many people discover infidelity but don't think to document the financial aspects. You've potentially saved yourself thousands in investigative costs. She spent nearly an hour reviewing everything, the dating profiles, the hidden properties, the secret accounts, the life insurance policy, naming his girlfriend as beneficiary. Her expression grew more serious as she discovered each new layer of David's deception. Sarah, what your husband has done goes beyond simple adultery. This is financial fraud. He's been using marital assets to fund extramarital relationships and hiding community property. In Colorado, this is called economic misconduct. What does that mean for me and Emma? It means the court will likely award you a larger share of the marital estate to compensate for his misuse of funds. Colorado is an equitable distribution state, but judges don't look kindly on spouses who steal from the marriage. Margaret explained Colorado's divorce laws in terms I could understand. Because we'd been married for 3 years and David had acquired most of his properties during our marriage, I had a claim to half of everything, including the real estate empire he'd been building in secret. The Boulder condo alone is worth $185,000, Margaret calculated. The Winter Park property, based on recent sales in the area, is probably worth $220,000. The duplex in Arvada could be worth $160,000. Even accounting for the mortgage, we're looking at significant equity. But he bought those properties without my knowledge. Don't I need to prove I contributed to them? In Colorado, property acquired during marriage is presumed to be marital property. Regardless of which spouse's name is on the deed, the burden is on David to prove these were separate assets, which he can't do since he used marital funds for the down payments. Margaret's assessment was encouraging, but she also warned me about the challenges ahead. David sounds intelligent and calculating. He'll likely fight hard to keep what he's built, and he'll probably claim the properties are business assets. Do you have any evidence of his actual income? I showed her the tax documents I'd found, the bank statements showing hidden income, and the commission records from his real estate business. Margaret's eyebrows rose as she calculated the numbers. He's been underreporting his contributions to the marital household by about $90,000 per year. That alone could entitle you to significant spousal support, especially given that you'll need childcare support to return to work. What about Emma? What are her rights? Child support in Colorado is calculated based on both parents' actual income, not what they choose to report. If David's been hiding income, he'll owe significantly more than he might expect. And given his financial deception, I suspect the court would be sympathetic to your request for primary custody. The life insurance policy naming Crystal as beneficiary was particularly problematic for David, Margaret explained. This shows clear intent to divert marital assets to an extramarital partner. It's exactly the kind of evidence judges remember when making property divisions. Can he change the beneficiary? Now that I know about it, he could try, but we'll file an immediate motion to prevent him from disposing of assets once we serve him with divorce papers. The court can freeze accounts, prevent property transfers, and require him to maintain existing insurance policies. Margaret outlined a strategy that was both protective and aggressive. We'd file for divorce immediately, requesting temporary support and exclusive use of the marital home. We'd demand full financial disclosure and ask the court to appoint a forensic accountant to trace all hidden assets. The goal is to move quickly before he can hide more assets or transfer properties, Margaret explained. Men like David often become desperate when they realize they've been caught. How long will this take? With the complexity of the financial issues, probably 6 to 12 months. But we can get temporary orders for support and custody within a few weeks. The consultation fee was $500, money I didn't really have, but Margaret offered a payment plan. I believe in your case, Sarah. The evidence is strong, and David's behavior is exactly what family courts are designed to address. As I left her office, I felt something I hadn't experienced in weeks: hope. For the first time since discovering David's betrayal, I had a plan. I wasn't just a victim anymore. I was a woman taking control of her situation. The business card Margaret gave me was simple white cardstock with elegant block lettering, but it represented so much more. It was proof that I was fighting back, that I refused to let David steal from Emma's future or treat us as disposable obstacles to his happiness. That evening, as I fed Emma her bottle and watched the peaceful expression on her sleeping face, I made her a promise. Mommy's going to make sure you're taken care of, sweetheart. We're going to be just fine. I tucked Margaret's business card into Emma's baby book, right next to her hospital bracelet and first photo. Someday, when she was older, I'd tell her about this moment, how her mother had chosen to fight for justice instead of accepting betrayal. David had counted on my silence, my fear, my inexperience with legal matters. He'd assumed I'd be too overwhelmed. With new motherhood to challenge his deceptions, he was about to learn how wrong he was. Margaret advised me to confront David strategically, with everything in place to protect Emma and myself. Don't give him time to hide assets or prepare his own strategy, she'd said. The element of surprise is your biggest advantage right now. I spent a week preparing for the conversation that would end my marriage. It felt surreal, planning the destruction of my family while simultaneously caring for our newborn daughter. But I knew there was no going back. David had already destroyed our marriage with his lies and betrayal. I was simply making it official. First, I secured our finances. Margaret had given me a list of immediate steps to protect myself, and I followed them methodically. I opened personal checking account at a different bank and transferred half of our joint savings money that was legally mine, but that David could have moved or hidden if he'd known what was coming. I also gathered every important document I could find. Emma's birth certificate, our marriage license, tax returns, insurance policies, and the deed to our house. I made copies of everything and stored the originals in a safety deposit box that David didn't know about. The most difficult part was setting up the recording equipment. Margaret had explained that Colorado was a one-party consent state, meaning I could legally record conversations without David's knowledge, as long as I was a participant. If he admits to the affairs or the financial deception, having it on record will strengthen your case immensely. She'd said, I bought a small digital recorder and tested it several times to make sure it would capture clear audio. I felt like a spy in my own home, but I reminded myself that David had been living a secret life for months. I was just evening the playing field. I chose a Friday evening for the confrontation, when David would be tired from the week and less likely to be sharp or defensive. I'd also arranged for Katie to take Emma for the night, supposedly so David and I could have some alone time to reconnect after the baby's birth. That's so sweet, David had said when I suggested it. I feel like we haven't had time to really talk since Emma arrived. The irony of his words wasn't lost on me. We hadn't had time to talk because he'd been too busy managing his relationships with other women and planning his exit from our marriage. On Friday afternoon, I prepared our house like a stage set. I put Emma's things away so David couldn't use her as a distraction or excuse to leave the room. I made his favorite dinner and opened a bottle of wine, not to be romantic, but to make him comfortable and relaxed. I needed him to be honest, and David was always more talkative after a glass or two of wine. I hid the recorder in the living room, testing it one more time to ensure it would pick up our conversation clearly. My hands were shaking as I pressed the record button, but my resolve was steady. This was about Emma's future, about justice, about making sure David faced consequences for his choices. Katie arrived at 5 p.m. to pick up Emma, and I could see the concern in her eyes as she looked at my face. Are you sure you're ready for this? She asked quietly, cradling Emma in her arms. I have to be. Emma deserves better than a father who sees her as an inconvenience. Call me if you need anything at all. After they left, I finished preparing dinner and set the table with our wedding china, another touch of irony that felt appropriate. We'd eaten off these plates at our wedding reception, promising to love and cherish each other through better and worse. David had clearly forgotten those vows, but I wanted the setting to remind him of what he was throwing away. David arrived home at 7 p.m., later than he'd promised, but earlier than usual. He seemed genuinely pleased to see the table set and dinner waiting. This is nice, he said, kissing my cheek in a gesture that felt more perfunctory than affectionate. It feels like forever since we've had a real evening together. I thought it was time, I said carefully. We need to talk about some things. Something flickered in his eyes, wariness, maybe, or guilt, but he smiled and poured himself a glass of wine. Of course, I've been meaning to talk to you too, actually. I wondered what he'd been meaning to discuss. His plans to leave us, his strategy for minimizing his financial obligations, his timeline for moving in with one of his girlfriends. We made small talk during dinner, discussing Emma's feeding schedule and his work week. David seemed relaxed, probably assuming this was just a normal domestic conversation between exhausted new parents. He had no idea that I'd spent weeks gathering evidence of his betrayal, that I'd already consulted with an attorney, that this dinner was really his last supper as my husband. After we finished eating, I suggested we move to the living room with our wine. David settled into his favorite chair, the one where he usually sat while scrolling through his phone and ignoring Emma's cries. Tonight, though, his phone was face down on the side table and his attention was focused on me. So he said, taking a sip of wine, "What did you want to talk about?" I looked at my husband, really looked at him, maybe for the last time as his wife. He was still handsome, still charming when he wanted to be, still capable of making me remember why I'd fallen in love with him. But now I could see the selfishness behind his smile, the calculation in his eyes, the way he was already mentally preparing his responses to whatever I might say. I thought about Emma, sleeping peacefully at Katie's house, unaware that her parents' marriage was about to end. I thought about the life I'd imagined for us, the family I'd wanted to build, the dreams that David had systematically destroyed with his lies and betrayal. Most of all, I thought about the woman I'd become over the past few weeks, stronger, more determined, more protective than I'd ever imagined I could be. David had underestimated me, but he was about to learn exactly what kind of mother he was dealing with. I reached for my wine glass, taking a stunning breath as I prepared to destroy the facade of our marriage once and for all. "I want to talk about your dating profiles," I said quietly, "and Jessica, and Amanda, and Crystal, and all the money you've been hiding from me." The color drained from David's face, and his wine glass stopped halfway to his lips. For the first time in our marriage, I had his complete attention. The confrontation was about to begin. The silence that followed my words was deafening. David's face went through a series of expressions: shock, fear, anger, and then something I'd never seen before, the cold calculation of a man who'd been caught and was trying to figure out his next move. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said finally, setting down his wine glass with forced steadiness. "Dating profiles? Sarah, you just had a baby. I think you might be experiencing some postpartum, don't." My voice was sharper than I'd intended, but his attempt to gaslight me ignited a fury I didn't know I possessed. "Don't you dare try to make this about my mental health. I know exactly what I saw." I pulled out my phone and showed him the screenshots I'd taken of his dating profiles. His face crumpled as he recognized his own photos, his own words advertising himself as single and available. "Where did you get these?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Your laptop? The one you left open when you went to show a house to the Richardsons? Except the Richardsons called looking for you that same day, wondering why you'd missed your appointment." David's jaw tightened. I could see him trying to construct a defense, searching for an explanation that might salvage the situation. But the evidence was too overwhelming, and we both knew it. "Sarah, you have to understand. I understand perfectly. You've been cheating on me throughout my entire pregnancy while stealing from our family's future to pay for your girlfriends." I pulled out the printed bank statements and credit card bills, spreading them across the coffee table like playing cards. "Would you like to explain the $2,800 Tiffany charge while you were telling me we couldn't afford a decent stroller?" David stared at the papers, his face growing paler with each document he recognized. "How long have you known?" "Long enough to talk to a divorce attorney." "Long enough to understand exactly what you've done to us? A divorce attorney?" For the first time, David looked truly panicked. "Sarah, we can work this out. We don't need lawyers involved. We needed honesty involved. We needed partnership involved. We needed you to act like a husband and father instead of a single man looking for his next conquest." I showed him the property records next, watching his expression change as he realized how much I'd discovered. The Boulder condo where Jessica lives, the Winter Park vacation rental, the duplex in Arvada, all bought with marital funds while you told me we were struggling financially. "Those are business investments," David said weakly. "I was trying to build our future, or your exit strategy." I pulled out the emails I'd found between him and his attorney. "Let me read this back to you. I need to understand my options for protecting business assets in the event of a divorce. What can I do to ensure she doesn't get half of everything I've worked for?" David's face went from pale to gray. He knew those emails, knew exactly what they revealed about his intentions. Sarah, you don't understand the context. The context is that you've been planning to leave me and Emma while I was carrying your child. The context is that you took out a life insurance policy naming Crystal as the beneficiary instead of your wife and daughter. How do you know about Crystal? The question slipped out before he could stop himself, and we both knew it was an admission. I know about all of them, David. Jessica, Amanda, Crystal, Michelle, Sophia. I've read every message, seen every receipt, traced every lie you've told me for the past year. David slumped back in his chair, the fight going out of him as he realized the scope of his exposure. What do you want from me? I want the truth. All of it. No more lies, no more gaslighting, no more pretending this is my imagination or postpartum depression. He was quiet for a long moment, staring at the evidence spread across our coffee table. When he finally spoke, his voice was hollow. It started about a year ago. Things felt different between us. You were so focused on getting pregnant, and I felt like I didn't matter anymore except as a sperm donor. I bit back my immediate response. This was his chance to explain himself, and I needed to hear what he had to say. The first profile was just for attention, he continued. I didn't plan to actually meet anyone, but then Jessica responded to my messages, and she was so different from how things were at home. Different how? She was interested in me, my work, my goals, my dreams. She didn't just see me as a potential father or a provider. She saw me as a man. The selfishness of his words was breathtaking. I was interested in you, David. I supported your career, celebrated your successes, listened to your dreams. But once I got pregnant, you started pulling away. You changed, he said, defensively. Everything became about the baby. Our conversations, our plans, even our intimacy. I felt like I'd lost my wife and gained a baby incubator. I was carrying your child. Of course things changed. I needed your support, not your resentment. David shook his head. It wasn't supposed to go this far. I kept telling myself I'd stop after the baby was born, that we'd figure things out. But then Emma arrived, and you were so consumed with being a mother, and you were so consumed with being anywhere but here. Do you know that you've spent maybe 2 hours total actually caring for your daughter? Do you know that you left us alone for a weekend when she was 8 days old? I needed space to think. You needed space to see Crystal. I found the hotel receipts, David. His shoulders sagged in defeat. How much do you know? Everything. Your real income, your hidden properties, your plans to divorce me after Emma was born. I know about the apartment you're paying for Jessica, the trips you've taken with Amanda, the money you've been gambling away in cryptocurrency while telling me we can't afford baby clothes. David looked at me with something that might have been respect if it weren't mixed with so much fear. You're not the woman I married. No, I'm not. The woman you married trusted you completely. She believed your lies and made excuses for your behavior. She put your needs before her own and convinced herself that love meant accepting whatever scraps of attention you were willing to give. I stood up feeling stronger and more confident than I had in months. But I'm Emma's mother now, and her mother doesn't accept betrayal or theft or abandonment. Her mother fights for what's right. Sarah, please, we can fix this. I'll end things. With the others, we'll go to counseling. I'll be a better husband. You had 9 months to be a better husband while I was pregnant. You had 3 weeks to be a better father since Emma was born. Instead, you've been planning your escape and spending our daughter's future on other women. I gathered up the evidence from the coffee table, stacking the papers neatly. I'm filing for divorce on Monday, David. Margaret Chen will be serving you with papers probably by Tuesday. Margaret Chen? David's voice cracked. Sarah, she's ruthless. She destroyed my friend Tom in his divorce. Good. Then she'd do a thorough job protecting Emma and me from your financial abuse. David tried one more approach, the one that might have worked on the old Sarah. Please don't do this. Think about Emma. She needs her father. Emma needs a father who chooses her over other women. She needs a father who doesn't see her as an obstacle to his happiness. She needs a father who doesn't steal from her college, fund to buy jewelry for his girlfriends. I looked at my husband, soon-to-be ex-husband, one final time. You made your choices, David. Every dating profile, every hidden account, every lie you told was a choice. Now I'm making mine. The recording device had captured everything. His admissions, his justifications, his complete lack of remorse for what he'd done to our family. Margaret would be very pleased with the evidence when I delivered it to her office on Monday morning . As I walked toward the stairs, David called after me. Where are you going? To pack your things. You can stay in a hotel tonight or with one of your girlfriends. I don't really care which. Sarah, this is my house too. Actually, it's not anymore. I spoke with Margaret about that. Since you've been using marital funds to support other women while neglecting your family, I have grounds to request exclusive use of the marital home, especially with a newborn. I paused at the bottom of the stairs and turned back to face him. David looked smaller somehow, diminished by the exposure of his lies. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for him. Almost. You know what the saddest part is, David? I would have forgiven almost anything if you'd just been honest with me. If you told me you were struggling with a pregnancy, with becoming a father, with feeling overwhelmed, we could have worked through it together. That's what marriage is supposed to be, Sarah. But instead, you chose to lie and cheat and steal. You chose to make me feel crazy for sensing something was wrong. You chose to prioritize strangers over your wife and daughter. Those were your choices, and now you get to live with the consequences. David sat in his chair, staring at the evidence of his betrayal scattered across our coffee table. What happens now? Now you pack a bag and leave. Tomorrow you start looking for an apartment and figuring out how you're going to explain to your family and friends why your marriage ended 3 weeks after your daughter was born. Monday, you'll get served with divorce papers, and we'll let the court decide what's fair. I started up the stairs, then stopped one more time. Oh, and David, change the beneficiary on that life insurance policy back to Emma and me. Tonight, Margaret will be checking on that first thing Monday morning. I didn't wait for his response. I went upstairs to our bedroom, my bedroom now, and began pulling his clothes from the closet, stuffing them into garbage bags since he didn't deserve. The dignity of his expensive luggage. Each item I packed was another step toward freedom, another symbol of my refusal to accept his betrayal. When I came back downstairs with 3 bags of his belongings, David was still sitting in the same chair, staring at nothing. He looked up as I set the bags by the front door. I never meant for it to happen this way, he said quietly. Yes, you did. You planned every step of this, David. The only thing you didn't plan for was getting caught. He stood up slowly like an old man and walked toward the door. As he reached for the bags, he turned back one more time. Can I see Emma tomorrow? You can see your daughter when your attorney arranges supervised visitation through the court. Until then, stay away from us. Sarah, she's my daughter too. Then you should have acted like her father instead of treating her like an inconvenience. David picked up his bags and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the doorknob, and for a moment I thought he might apologize, might show some genuine remorse for what he'd done to us. Instead, he said, "You'll regret this. When the lawyers are done, when you're struggling to pay the bills and raise Emma alone, you'll realize you threw away a good thing." I looked at this man I'd once loved, this stranger who'd shared my bed and fathered my child, and felt nothing but pity. David, the only good thing to come out of our marriage is Emma, and I'll make sure she knows she deserves better than a man who abandons his family for the next exciting thing that comes along. He left without another word, and I locked the door behind him. I stood in the sudden silence of our house, listening to the sound of his car pulling out of our driveway for the last time. Then I called Katie. "You can bring Anna home now," I said when she answered. "Her father is gone, and we're going to be just fine." The weekend after David left was strangely peaceful. Emma seemed to sense the change in the household's energy. She slept better, fussed less, and even gave me her first real smile Sunday morning as I fed her breakfast. It was as if removing the source of tension from our home had allowed both of us to breathe easier. But Monday morning brought reality, crashing back when Margaret called with disturbing news. "Sarah, we have a problem," she said, her usually calm voice tight with concern. "David's been busy this weekend. He's transferred significant funds out of several accounts and filed paperwork to dissolve his LAC. My blood ran cold. What does that mean? It means he's trying to hide assets before we can freeze them. I'm filing an emergency motion this morning, but he's already moved about $150,000 from his business accounts to places we can't immediately trace." I felt sick. Even after everything I'd discovered, even after confronting him with overwhelming evidence, David was still trying to cheat Emma and me out of what was rightfully ours. "There's more," Margaret continued. "He's also transferred the deed to the Winter Park property to someone named Crystal Morrison. Apparently, she's now the sole owner of a $220,000 vacation home. Crystal, the nurse from Colorado Springs, the woman who'd been named as the beneficiary on David's life insurance policy. Can he do that? Just give away marital property?" "Not legally, but he's done it. We'll have to fight to get it back, which means more time and more legal fees." "Sarah, I think you need to understand what we're really dealing with here." Margaret asked me to come to her office that afternoon, and when I arrived with Emma sleeping in her car seat, she had even more devastating news spread across her conference table. "I've been digging deeper into David's activities over the weekend," she said, showing me a timeline she'd constructed. "This wasn't a panicked reaction to your confrontation. This was a carefully planned asset transfer that he's been preparing for weeks." She showed me documents David had filed the Friday before our confrontation applications to refinance the Boulder condo, requests to dissolve business partnerships, and forms to transfer his real estate license to a new brokerage. "He knew you were onto him, Sarah. Somehow he figured out that you'd discovered his secrets. But how?" "I was so careful. It doesn't matter how. What matters is that David has been systematically moving assets beyond your reach. The good news is that we can trace most of it and prove fraud. The bad news is that it's going to be a much longer and more expensive fight than we originally anticipated." Margaret pulled out a thick folder labeled with David's name. "I've been investigating your husband since our first meeting, and what I found suggests this pattern goes back much further than you realized." She showed me property records dating back to before our marriage. David had been buying and selling real estate through shell companies for years, always keeping the most valuable assets in his name only. The house we lived in, the one I thought was our family home, was actually titled solely to David, despite my contributions to the down payment and mortgage. "He's what we call a financial predator," Margaret explained. "Someone who uses marriage as a cover for asset accumulation while keeping escape routes prepared. The affairs were probably always part of the plan. He needed to establish alternative relationships before ending your marriage." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Our entire relationship had been a lie. David hadn't fallen out of love with me during my pregnancy. He'd never truly loved me at all. I'd been a useful partner while he built his empire, but always expendable. "There's something else," Margaret said gently. "We found evidence that you're not the first." She showed me records of David's previous marriage, one he'd never mentioned. A woman named Lisa Patterson married to David for 2 years before their divorce. The divorce decree showed a pattern eerily similar to what he'd tried to do to me. Hidden assets, secret accounts, and claims that his business holdings were separate property. Lisa got almost nothing in her divorce, Margaret said. David successfully argued that his real estate investments were premarital business assets. She was left with debt and legal fees, while he kept a portfolio worth hundreds of thousands. I stared at the documents, feeling naive and foolish. He's done this before. Multiple times, we think. We're still investigating, but there are records of at least 2 other short-term relationships where women reported similar financial abuse. David appears to be a serial marriage fraudster. The weight of David's deception was overwhelming. Emma wasn't just the daughter of an unfaithful husband. She was the child of a professional con artist who targeted me specifically for my stability and trustworthiness. Why me? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Teachers make excellent targets, Margaret said sadly. You have steady income, good credit, and a trusting nature. Plus, you're not likely to understand complex financial arrangements or question business decisions. David probably saw you as the perfect mark. She showed me the final piece of evidence, emails between David and his attorney discussing his exit timeline. The plan had been to establish paternity for Emma, then file for divorce, claiming I was an unfit mother due to postpartum depression. He'd intended to seek primary custody while minimizing his financial obligations. The pregnancy was never about starting a family, Margaret explained. It was about creating leverage. Fathers who can claim their ex-wives are mentally unstable often get favorable custody arrangements and reduced support obligations. I felt physically ill. Every tender moment during my pregnancy, every time David had seemed excited about the baby, every promise he'd made about our future together, it had all been part of a calculated plan to use and discard me. What about Emma? I asked, my voice shaking. What does this mean for her? It means we fight harder, Margaret said firmly. David made a crucial mistake. He underestimated you. Instead of the easy victim he expected, he's dealing with a woman who documented everything and sought legal help immediately. We can prove fraud, we can prove his pattern of behavior, and we can protect Emma from growing up with a father who sees her as a tool rather than a daughter. As I drove home with Emma sleeping peacefully in her car seat, I realized that David's betrayal was even worse than I'd imagined. He hadn't just cheated on me. He targeted me as a victim from the very beginning. Our marriage, my pregnancy, Emma's birth, it had all been part of his plan to acquire assets and establish legal claims before discarding us. But David had made one fatal error. He'd chosen the wrong woman to target. Because while he'd been planning his deception, I'd been becoming a mother. And Emma's mother would fight with everything she had to protect her daughter from a man who saw her as nothing more than leverage in his next con game. The deed to the Winter Park property might have Crystal's name on it now, but I had something more powerful, the truth, documented evidence, and the fierce determination of a woman who refused to let her daughter become another casualty of David's greed. Something fundamental changed in me the moment I learned that David had planned to use my mental health against me to steal custody of Emma. The heartbreak I'd been carrying for weeks transformed into something much more powerful, a mother's protective fury that I didn't know I was capable of. That night, as I held Emma for her midnight feeding, I looked down at her perfect little face and made a vow that went deeper than any wedding promise I'd ever made. No one will ever use you as a weapon against me, I whispered to her. And no one will ever make you feel like you're not wanted or loved completely. I called Margaret first thing Tuesday morning, my voice steadier than it had been in weeks. I want to go on the offensive, I told her. I don't want to just defend myself against David's lies. I want to expose him for what he is. Sarah, I understand your anger, but we need to be strategic. I am being strategic. David's counting on me being the passive victim who accepts whatever scraps the court gives me. He's expecting the same playbook that worked with his ex-wife. Lisa, But he's not dealing with a broken woman who doesn't know her rights. He's dealing with Emma's mother. Margaret was quiet for a moment. What do you have in mind? I want to file counterclaims for fraud, request a forensic audit of all his financial activities for the past 5 years, and I want to demand full custody with supervised visitation only. And I want to subpoena the records from his previous marriages. That single quotes S. aggressive and expensive. He stole from my daughter's future to buy jewelry for other women. He planned to claim I was mentally unfit to gain custody leverage. Aggressive is exactly what this situation calls for. Over the next week, I threw myself into the legal battle with the same intensity I'd once brought to lesson planning. One researched Colorado family law, studied cases similar to mine, and worked with Margaret to build a comprehensive strategy that would expose every aspect of David's deception. The birth certificate became a symbol of my determination. Unlike the marriage license that David and I had signed together, Emma's birth certificate was mine alone. I was listed as her mother, the person responsible for her care and protection. David was listed as her father, but that was just biology. He'd have to prove himself worthy of the title through his actions. Arranged for a professional photographer to take portraits of Emma and me together, images that showed a happy, healthy mother and baby. If David wanted to claim I was suffering from postpartum depression, I'd have evidence to the contrary. Photos captured Emma's bright, alert eyes and my confident, peaceful expression proved that we were thriving without him. The most difficult moment came when I had to change Emma's pediatrician's records. David had been listed as an emergency contact with full medical decision-making authority. Now I removed his name and added Katie instead. It was a small bureaucratic change, but it felt like drawing a line in the sand. David would not have access to Emma until he proved he deserved it. I also opened a $529 education savings account in Emma's name, funding it with money from our joint savings before David could hide it. Every dollar I put away was a promise to my daughter that her future mattered, that her education would be protected regardless of what her father had stolen. Margaret filed our countersuit on Thursday, and by Friday afternoon, David's attorney was calling, requesting an emergency meeting. He wants to settle, Margaret told me. His lawyer says David is willing to discuss terms. What kind of terms? Standard joint custody, division of marital assets, reasonable child support. They're trying to make this look like a normal divorce instead of the fraud case it really is. I thought about David's previous pattern, how he'd managed to convince courts that his assets were separate property while his ex-wives walked away with nothing. Tell them no. We proceed with the full audit and fraud claims. Sarah, settlement might be faster and less expensive. This isn't about money anymore, Margaret. It's about making sure David can't do this to the next woman or to Emma when she's old enough to understand that her father sees her as a commodity. That weekend, I did something that surprised even me. I reached out to Lisa Patterson, David's previous wife. Margaret had tracked down her contact information, and after much internal debate, I decided to call her. "I'm sorry to bother you," I said when she answered. "My name is Sarah Mitchell. I'm David's current wife, and I'm going through a divorce. I was hoping you might be willing to talk to me about your experience." There was a long pause. "Oh, honey," Lisa said finally, her voice filled with sympathy. "What did he do to you?" "Lisa." And I talked for 2 hours. Her story was heartbreakingly similar to mine. The charming courtship, the gradual emotional withdrawal, the discovery of hidden assets and secret relationships. But Lisa had been isolated and scared during her divorce, without the support system or legal resources I'd managed to assemble. "He made me feel crazy," she told me. Every time I questioned his behavior or asked about money, he'd say I was being paranoid or dramatic. By the time I found out about the other women, I was so beaten down that I just wanted it to be over. Did you know about his pattern? That he'd done this before? Not until it was too late. Sarah, you have to understand David is very good at making women feel like they're the problem. He finds successful, independent women and gradually undermines their confidence until they're dependent on him for validation. Lisa agreed to provide a sworn statement about David's behavior during their marriage, corroborating the pattern of financial deception and emotional manipulation. Her testimony would be crucial in proving that David's actions weren't the result of marital problems, but part of a deliberate strategy. As I hung up from that conversation, I realized that David had made a fundamental miscalculation. He'd chosen his victims based on their trustworthiness and stability. But those same qualities made us formidable opponents once we understood what we were fighting. I wasn't the isolated, frightened woman he'd counted on. I was Emma's mother. I had a strong support system, and I documented every aspect of his betrayal. Most importantly, I had something to fight for that was more important than my own hurt feelings, my daughter's future. That night, as I watched Emma sleep in her crib, I felt a peace I hadn't experienced since discovering David's betrayal. The scared, confused woman who'd found those dating profiles was gone. And her place was someone David had never met and couldn't have prepared for. A mother who would do whatever it took to protect her child. Emma stirred in her sleep, making the soft baby sounds that never failed to make me smile. I gently straightened her blanket and whispered, "Sweet dreams, baby girl. Mommy's got everything under control." For the first time in weeks, I believed it was true. Margaret's plan to secure our financial position moved swiftly once the court granted our motion to freeze David's assets. Within 48 hours of filing our countersuit, we had access to financial records that David had tried desperately to hide. And what we found exceeded even my worst expectations. The forensic accountant Margaret recommended, a sharp woman named Patricia Valdez, discovered that David's pattern of financial deception went back 7 years and involved multiple banks, shell companies, and hidden accounts across 3 states. His total hidden assets were worth over $800,000 money that should have been considered marital property. "Your husband is remarkably sophisticated in his fraud," Patricia told me during our meeting. "He's been using legitimate business structures to hide personal assets, creating paper trails that would fool most people who weren't specifically looking for deception." But the most shocking discovery came when Patricia traced the source of David's down payments for his property purchases. He hadn't been using his real estate commissions to fund his investments. He'd been using credit, lines secured against properties he'd purchased during previous relationships. "He's essentially been running a Ponzi scheme," Patricia explained, "using equity from one relationship to fund acquisitions during the next, always staying one step ahead of discovery until the relationship ends." This meant that the Boulder condo, the Winter Park property, even the duplex in Arvada were all purchased with leverage that could collapse if his ex-wives ever came forward to claim their rightful shares. David had built his empire on a foundation of stolen assets from multiple women. I felt sick thinking about how many lives he'd destroyed, but I also felt empowered. This evidence proved that David was a serial predator, not just an unfaithful husband having a midlife crisis. Margaret used this information to file additional motions that would protect Emma and me while exposing David's criminal behavior. Requested court orders that would prevent him from transferring any additional assets, require him to post bond for potential fraud damages, and most importantly, limit his access to Emma until he could prove he was a fit father. The pattern of deception shows a fundamental lack of character, Margaret argued in her filing. David Mitchell has demonstrated that he views relationships as vehicles for asset acquisition rather than genuine emotional partnerships. Allowing him unsupervised access to his daughter creates a risk that he will view her as another tool for manipulation. David's response was predictably desperate. His attorney filed motions claiming I was engaging in parental alienation and requesting emergency custody because I was clearly suffering from severe postpartum depression that made me paranoid and vindictive. But we were ready for this attack. The photos I'd taken with Emma, the statement from her pediatrician confirming her excellent care, and testimony from Katie and my other support system members painted a picture of a competent, loving mother who was simply protecting her child from a dangerous situation. The bank transfer records became our most powerful weapon. Patricia had traced every hidden transaction, every secret account, every fraudulent transfer that David had made over the years. The pattern was so clear that even David's attorneys seemed shocked by the scope of his client's deception, but the most devastating evidence came from an unexpected source, Crystal Morrison, the nurse from Colorado Springs who'd received the Winter Park property. Crystal called Margaret's office 3 days after David transferred the deed to her name. She'd been reading news coverage of our divorce case and realized she'd been manipulated just as badly as I had been. I need to give this property back, Crystal told Margaret during a conference call I was allowed to join. David told me he was single, going through a bitter divorce with an ex-wife who was trying to steal his business assets. He said the property transfer was just a temporary measure to protect it from unfair claims. Crystal had been completely unaware that David was married with a newborn daughter. She'd believed his story about being victimized by a greedy ex-wife and had agreed to help him protect his assets. When she learned the truth about Emma and me, she was horrified. I'm a nurse, she said, her voice shaking. I help families. I would never knowingly participate in stealing from a mother and baby. David lied to all of us. Crystal agreed to testify about David's deception and to transfer the Winter Park property back to marital assets. Her cooperation destroyed David's claim that the property transfers were legitimate business transactions rather than attempts to hide assets from the divorce court. Even Jessica, the marketing executive from Boulder, came forward after Crystal contacted her. Jessica had also been told that David was divorced, that his ex-wife was harassing him with false claims about hidden assets. She'd believed she was in a relationship with a successful divorced father who was being treated unfairly by the legal system. He showed me fake court documents, Jessica told Margaret. Papers that supposedly proved his ex-wife was lying about their finances. I believed him because why would someone forge legal documents just to impress a girlfriend? David had created an entire fictional narrative to justify his behavior to the women he was dating. Each of them believed they were helping him overcome the vindictive attacks of a greedy ex-wife. None of them knew about the others, and none of them knew that the ex-wife was actually his pregnant wife. Margaret compiled all of this evidence into a comprehensive filing that painted David not just as an unfaithful husband, but as a sophisticated criminal who'd been running marriage fraud schemes for years. The documentation was so overwhelming that David's attorney requested a private meeting to discuss settlement options, but I'd moved beyond accepting whatever David was willing to offer. The evidence showed that Emma and I were entitled to far more than half of the marital assets we were entitled to. Compensation for years of financial fraud that had stolen from our family's future. I want full restitution, I told Margaret. Not just half of what we can prove exists, but compensation for everything he stole and everything he cost us in legal fees and emotional damage. Sarah, that's asking for a lot. He stole from my daughter's future to buy jewelry for women he was lying to. He planned to claim I was mentally unfit to gain custody leverage. He's a serial marriage fraudster who targeted me specifically because he thought I'd be easy to manipulate and discard. I looked at the bank transfer records spread across Margaret's desk, each one representing another betrayal, another lie, another dollar stolen from Emma's future. If we don't hold him accountable for everything he's done, he'll just find another target and do it again. Margaret nodded slowly. Okay, Let's show them what happens when they underestimate a mother, protecting her child. As I left her office that day, I realized that David's greatest mistake hadn't been underestimating my intelligence or my ability to uncover his lies. His greatest mistake had been not understanding that becoming Emma's mother had transformed me into someone who would never back down from a fight that mattered. The scared, trusting woman he'd married was gone. In her place was a warrior who had every receipt, every document, and every piece of evidence needed to make sure he faced consequences for every life he damaged. The call from Jessica came on a Wednesday morning while I was feeding Emma her bottle. I almost didn't answer the unfamiliar number, but something made me pick up on the fourth ring. "Is this Sarah Mitchell?" The voice was tentative, nervous. "Yes." "Who is this?" "My name is Jessica Walsh, I think." "I think we need to talk about David." My blood ran cold. Jessica, the marketing executive, the woman David had bought the Boulder condo for, the one he'd taken to Vail while telling me it was a business conference. I'd seen her name in hundreds of his text messages, but I'd never heard her voice. "What, about David?" I asked her carefully, shifting Emma to my shoulder for burping. "I saw the news coverage about your divorce case. About the fraud allegations." Her voice was shaking. "Sarah, I had no idea you existed. I had no idea David was married." I was quiet for a moment, processing this. Of all the things I expected from David's girlfriends, this wasn't one of them. "He told me he was divorced," Jessica continued when I didn't respond. "He said his ex-wife was trying to steal his business assets, that she was making false claims about hidden money. He showed me court documents. Those were fake," I said quietly. "I know that now. When I saw the real court filings online, when I read about you and the baby ... double quotes, she started crying. "Sarah, I am so sorry. I would never have gotten involved if I'd known the truth." Something in her voice, the genuine distress, the shock made me believe her. David had lied to Jessica just as effectively as he'd lied to me. We were both his victims, just in different ways. "How long were you seeing him?" I asked. 4 months. He told me he'd been divorced for over a year, that he was ready to start fresh with someone new. The condo, he said, it was an investment, property that he was letting me rent at a discount because we were dating. 4 months. That meant David had started his relationship with Jessica when I was 5 months pregnant, right around the time I'd started having trouble sleeping because of Emma's kicks. "Jessica, I need you to know something. David wasn't divorced. He wasn't even separated. We were living together as husband and wife throughout your entire relationship. I was pregnant with his daughter, and she was born 3 weeks ago." The silence that followed was broken only by Jessica's quiet sobbing. "I can't believe this," she whispered. "I thought I was smarter than this. I thought I was too careful to get involved with someone like this. David is very good at making women feel special while hiding the truth. You're not stupid. You're another victim of his lies." The weekends he spent with me, the trips we took, he told me those were work conferences and client emergencies. I was home alone, pregnant, while he was building a life with you based on lies. Jessica was quiet for several minutes, and I could hear her trying to compose herself. When she spoke again, her voice was stronger, angrier. "What can I do to help? I want to make this right." "You've already helped by calling Crystal and getting her to return the Winter Park property. But if you're serious about making things right, I could use your testimony about David's deception." "Absolutely. Whatever you need." Margaret arranged a meeting for the next day, and I found myself sitting across from the woman who'd unknowingly been part of destroying my marriage. Jessica was beautiful in the effortless way I'd expected, blonde, fit, professionally dressed. But she was also clearly devastated by learning the truth about David. "I brought everything," she said, sliding a thick folder across the table to Margaret. "Every text message, every email, every receipt from our dates." all the fake court documents. He showed me photos from our trips together. She looked at me with tears in her eyes. Sarah, I need you to know that I asked him directly several times if he was really divorced. He showed me what he said was his divorce decree. He had photos on his phone that showed him living alone. He even had mail delivered to the condo with his name only. David had created an elaborate fiction to support his double life. The condo wasn't just a place for Jessica to live. It was the set for his performance as a divorced man starting over. He talked about his ex-wife constantly, Jessica continued. Always negatively. He said she was trying to destroy him financially, that she was bitter about the divorce and making false accusations. He made me feel sorry for him. Margaret was taking notes furiously. Did he ever mention Sarah by name or the baby? Never. He called her my ex or she. I thought it was just painful for him to talk about. And he never mentioned a baby at all when I saw the news stories about a newborn daughter. Jessica's voice broke again. The text messages Jessica provided painted a picture of David's manipulation that was even more disturbing than what I'd found on his laptop. He'd been actively recruiting Jessica as an ally against me, convincing her that I was the villain in our story. In one message thread, David had written, "My ex is threatening to take me back to court over some business properties. She wants half of everything I've worked for, even though she never contributed to building the business." Jessica had responded, "That's horrible. You work so hard. Is there anything I can do to help? Just being here for me is enough. It's nice to finally be with someone who appreciates me instead of just seeing me as a paycheck." He'd been using Jessica's sympathy to justify his behavior while painting me as a gold digger who didn't deserve his support. Every lie he told her was designed to make her feel special while making me seem unreasonable. "The night you gave birth," Jessica said quietly, "David canceled our date last minute. He said there was a family emergency he had to deal with." A family emergency. That's how David had described the birth of his daughter to his girlfriend. Not a celebration, not a life-changing moment of joy, but an emergency that interfered with his real plans. "I should have known something was wrong," Jessica continued. "He was different after that night. More distant, more secretive. He kept saying he was dealing with complications from his divorce." Margaret asked Jessica to sign a sworn statement detailing David's deception and agreeing to testify if necessary. But Jessica offered something more valuable than just testimony. "I work in marketing," she said. "I know how to research people, how to trace digital footprints. If David has done this to other women, I can probably find them." Within a week, Jessica had tracked down 2 other women who'd had relationships with David over the past 3 years. Both had similar stories. David had claimed to be divorced, shown them fake legal documents, and gradually involved them in what he claimed were efforts to protect his assets from a vindictive ex-wife. One woman, a nurse named Amanda, had actually helped David move money between accounts, believing she was helping him hide assets from unfair court claims. Another, a teacher like me named Michelle, had cosigned for a credit card that David used to fund his dating expenses, thinking she was helping him rebuild his credit after his divorce. Each woman had been carefully chosen for specific qualities: professional stability, trusting nature, and enough financial resources to be useful to David's schemes. We were all educated, successful women who'd been targeted precisely because we were the type of people who would never suspect such elaborate deception. Jessica coordinated with all of David's victims, creating a network of women who'd been harmed by his lies. She set up a group chat where we could share information and support each other through the legal process. "I can't undo the damage I unknowingly helped cause," Jessica told me at the end of our meeting. "But I can make sure David faces consequences for what he's done to all of us." David had thought he was so clever, playing different women against each other while keeping us all isolated and ignorant. But his elaborate deceptions had backfired spectacularly. Instead of creating enemies, he'd created a coalition of women who were all determined to make sure he never hurt anyone else the way he'd hurt us that evening. As I tucked Emma into her crib, I thought about the unlikely friendship that was forming with Jessica. We'd both been betrayed by the same man, both lied to and manipulated, both used as pawns in his selfish games. But there was a crucial difference between us. I had Emma. Whatever David had stolen from me personally, whatever pain he'd caused, I had something beautiful and pure that came from our relationship. Emma was innocent of her father's sins, and she deserved to know that she'd been wanted and loved by at least one of her parents from the moment she was conceived. Jessica didn't have that comfort. Her entire relationship with David had been built on lies. Every memory tainted by the knowledge that she'd been manipulated from the very first conversation. In some ways, her betrayal was even more complete than mine, but now Jessica knew the truth, and her anger was a force that David hadn't anticipated. Hell hath no fury like a woman scorned, but hell hath no fury like multiple women who realize they've been systematically deceived by the same predator. As I settled into bed that night, Emma sleeping peacefully in her bassinet beside me, I smiled, thinking about David's shocked face when he learned that his victims had banded together against him. He'd counted on our shame, our isolation, our willingness to suffer in silence. Instead, he created an army of women who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain from exposing his true nature. Tomorrow, Jessica would be giving her sworn statement to Margaret. By the end of the week, Amanda and Michelle would be providing their testimony as well. David's carefully constructed lies were unraveling faster than he could spin new ones, and at the center of it all was Emma, the innocent catalyst who transformed me from a trusting wife into a protective mother willing to fight for justice. David had made many mistakes, but his biggest one was underestimating what happens when women stop competing with each other and start comparing notes. The courtroom was packed the morning of our final hearing. Word had spread through Denver's legal community about the scope of David's fraud, and several attorneys had come to observe what one lawyer called a masterclass in financial deception and its consequences. I sat at the plaintiff's table with Margaret, Emma sleeping peacefully in her carrier beside me. Across the aisle, David sat with his attorney, looking smaller and more defeated than I'd ever seen him. The confident, charming man I'd married had been replaced by someone who looked like he hadn't slept in weeks. Judge Patricia Morales was known for being tough but fair, especially in cases involving children. She'd reviewed all our evidence over the past month, including the testimonies from Jessica, Crystal, Amanda, and Michelle. David's pattern of deception was so well documented that even his own attorney had advised him to seek a plea agreement rather than contest the charges. Mr. Mitchell, Judge Morales began, her voice stern but controlled. I have reviewed the extensive evidence presented in this case, and I must say that in 30 years on the bench, I have rarely seen such systematic and deliberate financial fraud within a marriage. David kept his eyes down, unable to meet the judge's gaze. The evidence shows that you used your position as a spouse and father to defraud not only your wife and daughter, but multiple other women who trusted you. You created elaborate fictional narratives to justify theft. You forged legal documents to support your lies, and you planned to use fabricated mental health claims to gain custody of your daughter for the purpose of reducing your financial obligations. Judge Morales held up the thick folder containing all our evidence. Mrs. Mitchell, your documentation of this case is extraordinary. The court commends your diligence in protecting not only your own interests, but those of your daughter and the other victims of Mr. Mitchell's fraud. Margaret had prepared me for various possible outcomes, but Judge Morales' ruling exceeded even our most optimistic projections. In the matter of property division, the judge continued. The court finds that Mr. Mitchell's systematic hiding and misuse of marital assets constitutes economic misconduct of the highest degree. Mrs. Mitchell is hereby awarded 75% of all marital assets, including the family home, the Boulder condominium, and Mr. Mitchell's real estate business interests. David's head snapped up at this. He had expected to lose some assets, but 75% was devastating. Furthermore, Judge Morales continued, Mr. Mitchell will be required to pay restitution to Mrs. Mitchell in the amount of $150,000 for funds that were fraudulently diverted from marital accounts to support extramarital relationships and hidden investments. But the judge wasn't finished. In the matter of child custody, the court finds that Mr. Mitchell's pattern of deception, his willingness to use his daughter as leverage in financial negotiations, and his absence during crucial early bonding periods demonstrate a fundamental lack of fitness for primary custody. My heart pounded as I waited for the custody ruling. Mrs. Mitchell is awarded primary physical custody of Emma Rose Mitchell. Mr. Mitchell will be granted supervised visitation only pending completion of court-ordered therapy and parenting classes. All visitation will be supervised by a court-appointed guardian until such time as Mr. Mitchell can demonstrate that he prioritizes his daughter's welfare over his own financial interests. David's attorney stood to object, but Judge Morales held up her hand. I'm not finished. Mr. Mitchell will pay child support in the amount of $2,400 per month, based on his actual income rather than the reduced figures he reported to his wife. He will also maintain a life insurance policy with Emma Mitchell as the sole beneficiary, and he will contribute $500 monthly to a college savings account in her name. The financial arrangements were more generous than I dared to hope, but Judge Morales had one more surprise. Additionally, the court is referring this case to the district attorney's office for possible criminal charges related to fraud and identity theft. Mr. Mitchell, you will surrender your passport and remain in Colorado pending the outcome of that investigation. David's face went completely white. He'd known he might lose money in custody, but criminal charges were a possibility he clearly hadn't prepared for. After the judge's ruling, Margaret and I gathered our papers while David and his attorney huddled in urgent conversation. As we prepared to leave, David approached our table. Sarah, he said quietly, can we talk? I looked at this man who'd fathered my daughter, who'd shared my bed and my dreams, who'd systematically betrayed everything I'd trusted him with. Emma stirred in her carrier, making the soft sounds that always made me smile. There's nothing left to say, David. You made your choices. I never meant for it to go this far. I never meant to hurt Emma. You planned to claim I was mentally unfit to gain custody leverage. You saw your daughter as a tool for financial manipulation. That's not accidentally hurting her. That's deliberately using her. David glanced down at Emma, and for a moment, I saw something that might have been genuine regret cross his face. Can I hold her? Just for a moment? I considered his request, then shook my head. You'll have supervised visitation once you complete your court-ordered programs. Until then, I need to protect her from any more instability. As Margaret and I walked toward the courthouse exit, reporters were waiting with questions about the case. One asked me how it felt to have won against my ex-husband. This wasn't about winning or losing, I told them. This was about making sure my daughter grows up knowing that actions have consequences and that people who harm families should be held accountable for their choices. Outside the courthouse, Jessica was waiting for me. She'd taken the day off, worked to attend the hearing, wanting to see David face justice for what he'd done to all of us. How do you feel? She asked as we walked to our cars. Relieved, exhausted, ready to focus on being Emma's mother instead of fighting her father. Jessica smiled. She's lucky to have you. That evening, as I fed Emma her bottle and looked around, our house legally and completely ours now, I thought about how much had changed in just 2 months. I'd gone from a trusting wife who made excuses for her husband's behavior to a single mother who'd successfully exposed a serial marriage fraudster. Emma looked up at me with her bright, curious eyes, and I whispered, "It's just you and me now, sweetheart." And that's exactly how it should be. The court documents from that day would go in Emma's baby book, right next to her birth certificate and first photos. Someday, when she was old enough to understand, I'd tell her about the day her mother fought for her future and won. But more importantly, I'd tell her about the strength that comes from standing up for what's right, the power of truth over deception, and the fierce love of a mother who will never let anyone treat her daughter as anything less than precious Dot David had. Thought he could use Emma as a pawn in his selfish games. Instead, she'd become the reason I found a strength I never knew I had. 6 months after the court ruling, I stood in front of my sophomore English class at Cherry Creek High School, holding up a teaching award I'd never expected to receive. The Colorado Education Association had honored me as Teacher of the Year for my work in developing a curriculum about financial literacy and recognizing manipulation, a program that had grown directly out of my own experience with David's deception. Mrs. Mitchell, one of my students, asked after class, "How did you come up with the idea for teaching us about financial fraud?" I smiled, thinking about Emma napping peacefully in the daycare center down the hall from my classroom. Sometimes, life teaches us lessons we never wanted to learn, but those lessons can help us protect other people from making the same mistakes. The award certificate would go on the wall of our home office, next to Emma's 6-month photos in the college, savings account statements that showed her education fund growing steadily. David's court-ordered contributions were automatically deposited each month, one of the few ways he remained connected to his daughter's life. His supervised visitation had been reduced to twice a month after he'd missed several appointments, claiming work conflicts. The court-appointed supervisor reported that David seemed uncomfortable and distracted during his time with Emma, more focused on his phone than on bonding with his daughter. I felt sad for Emma, but not surprised by David's behavior. The criminal charges against David had been settled with a plea agreement. He pled guilty to financial fraud and identity theft, receiving 2 years of probation and community service rather than jail time. His real estate license had been revoked, and he'd been forced to sell his remaining properties to pay restitution to his various victims. Jessica and I had developed an unlikely but genuine friendship over the months. She'd started a support group for women who'd been victims of romance fraud, and we often spoke at workshops about the warning signs of financial manipulation. Our shared experience with David had bonded us in a way that felt healing rather than painful. "You saved me from wasting years of my life with someone who would never have valued me," Jessica told me over coffee one Saturday morning while Emma played in her bouncy seat between us. "I'm actually grateful to have learned the truth, even though it hurt." Crystal had moved back to Colorado Springs and returned to nursing full-time. She'd used her experience with David to become an advocate for other healthcare workers who'd been targeted by financial predators. "People assume nurses are too smart to fall for scams," she told me, "but caring, trusting people are exactly who these con artists target." The house felt different now that it was truly mine. I'd redecorated Emma's nursery, painted the living room a warm yellow that made everything feel brighter, and converted David's home office into a playroom where Emma could safely explore as she grew. Every change was a step away from the life David had tried to impose on us, and toward the future Emma and I were building together. Dot, my sister. Katie had been my rock throughout the entire process, babysitting Emma during court hearings and celebrating each legal victory with the fierce joy of someone who had watched her sister find her strength. "I'm so proud of who you've become," she told me one evening as we watched Emma practice, rolling over on her playmat. "You've turned the worst thing that could have happened into something that made you stronger." The financial security from the divorce settlement had given me options I'd never expected. I could afford to take summers off to be with Emma, to hire reliable childcare during the school year, and to start saving for graduate school. David's attempts to steal my future had ironically provided me with more opportunities than I'd ever had, but the most profound change was in how I saw myself. The woman who'd made excuses for David's absences and believed his lies about money troubles was gone. In her place was someone who trusted her instincts, asked hard questions, and refused to accept treatment that fell short of what she deserved. Emma was thriving in ways that amazed me daily. At 6 months old, she was hitting all her developmental milestones, sleeping through the night, and showing the kind of sunny disposition that made everyone who met her smile. Her pediatrician had commented on how secure and well-adjusted she seemed, despite the upheaval of her early months. She knows she's loved, Dr. Patterson had told me during Emma's checkup. Children can sense when they're truly wanted and prioritized. Whatever challenges she faces in the future, she have that foundation of security to build on. I'd started dating again, cautiously and with much better boundaries than I'd had before. A fellow teacher named Mark had been persistently kind and patient, understanding that I came with considerable baggage and a beautiful daughter who would always be my first priority. He had waited 3 months before even asking for my phone number, proving his intentions through consistent actions rather than charming words. I admire what you've done, Mark told me on our 3rd date, watching me check my phone for updates from Emma's babysitter. The way you fought for your daughter shows the kind of character that's rare these days. The dating app profiles that had destroyed my marriage had led to new knowledge about how to recognize authentic people versus those who were performing authenticity. I knew now what genuine interest looked like, what real partnership felt like, and what I would never accept again. David had tried to contact me several times over the months, usually through his attorney, requesting modifications to the custody arrangement or asking for reduced child support payments. Each request was denied by the court, which had grown tired of his attempts to relitigate settled matters. His most recent message, delivered through his lawyer, had been a request to have Emma overnight for his birthday. Margaret had replied that overnight visits would only be considered after David completed his parenting classes and therapy, requirements he'd been putting off for months. He still doesn't understand that Emma isn't a possession he can access. When convenient, Margaret had told me, she's a person who deserves consistency and prioritization. As I drove home from school that day, Emma babbling happily in her car seat, I thought about how completely our lives had changed. A year ago, I'd been a pregnant woman, worried about whether my husband loved me. Now I was a successful single mother who'd exposed a serial marriage fraudster and helped protect other women from becoming his victims. That evening, as I gave Emma her bath and listened to her delighted squeals as she splashed in the warm water, I felt a peace that had nothing to do with winning legal battles or receiving recognition awards. It was the peace that comes from knowing you've chosen love over fear, truth over convenience, and your child's welfare over social expectations. Emma looked up at me with her bright, trusting eyes, and I whispered, tomorrow we're going to read your favorite book and play with your blocks and maybe go to the park if it's sunny. Just me and you, sweetheart, making our own adventures. The teaching award was nice and the legal victory had been necessary, but these quiet moments with my daughter in the home we'd fought to keep, this was the real prize. Emma's first birthday party was everything David's presence would have ruined and everything his absence made perfect. Our living room was decorated with sunflowers, the same flowers David had once surprised me with during our courtship, now reclaimed as symbols of Emma's bright future rather than reminders of his deception. 20 of our closest friends and family members gathered to celebrate the most important year of my life. Katie had made Emma's cake, a beautiful yellow confection shaped like a sunflower. Jessica came with a thoughtful gift, a savings bond for Emma's college fund. Even Crystal drove up from Colorado Springs, bringing handmade baby clothes she'd knitted during quiet nights at the hospital. "Look at her," my mother said, watching Emma clap her hands with delight as we sang "Happy Birthday." "She's absolutely radiant." "You've done an amazing job, sweetheart." Emma had grown into a confident, curious toddler who charmed everyone she met. She was walking now, babbling constantly, and showing signs of the same determination that had carried me through the divorce. When she wanted something, she didn't give up easily, a trait that would serve her well in life. David hadn't asked to attend the party. In fact, he'd missed his last 3 scheduled visitations, claiming work conflicts that his probation officer was investigating. His disinterest in Emma's daily life had become so consistent that I'd stopped being disappointed and started feeling relieved. Emma deserved better than a father who saw her as an obligation rather than a joy dot as I watched Emma play with her new toys. Surrounded by people who genuinely loved her, I thought about the woman I'd been a year ago. Pregnant, trusting, making excuses for a man who was systematically betraying everything we built together. That woman felt like a stranger, now someone I remembered fondly but could never be again. The first birthday photo I took that day showed Emma in her yellow party dress, sitting surrounded by wrapping paper and toys, grinning at the camera with chocolate frosting on her chin. It was a picture of pure joy, untainted by the complications of her father's choices. This photo would go in her baby book next to all the others: the hospital bracelet, the court documents, the teaching award artifacts of our journey from betrayal to triumph. After the guests left and Emma was napping, I sat in her nursery, holding the card Jessica had brought. Inside, she'd written, "Emma is lucky to have a mother who chose truth over comfort, justice over peace, and love over fear. Happy first birthday to the little girl who saved us all by giving her mother a reason to fight." The journey from discovery to justice had taken 8 months, but the journey to healing would take much longer. I still had moments of anger when I thought about David's selfishness. Still felt sad that Emma would grow up with a father who'd chosen his own gratification over his family's welfare. But those moments were increasingly outweighed by gratitude. For the life we'd built without him, my advice to other women had become simple. Trust your instincts. Document everything and never let anyone convince you that protecting yourself and your children is somehow wrong. The greatest gift David had unknowingly given me was proof of my own strength. I'd never known I possessed until I needed it to protect Emma. The support group Jessica and I had started now helped dozens of women recognize and escape financial manipulation. We'd prevented at least 3 women from marrying men who'd exhibited David's pattern of behavior, and we'd helped several others recover assets they'd thought were lost forever. "You've turned your pain into purpose," one woman told me after a workshop where I'd shared our story. Emma's going to grow up knowing that her mother fought for justice, not just for herself, but for other families too. As I tucked Emma into her crib that night, she looked up at me with sleepy eyes and whispered what sounded like "Mama," her first clear word. I kissed her forehead and whispered back, "I love you, sweet girl, more than all the stars in the sky." The house was quiet as I made my evening tea and reflected on the year that had changed everything. The living room still held traces of the party, a few forgotten balloons, crumbs from Emma's cake, the lingering scent of sunflowers. Tomorrow I'd clean it all up, but tonight I wanted to savor the evidence of our celebration. David had contacted my attorney that week, asking for reduced child support, claiming his new job paid less than his previous real estate career. Margaret had responded that his financial obligations to Emma were non-negotiable and that any future attempts to reduce support would be met with wage garnishment. He still doesn't understand that Emma's needs don't change based on his convenience, Margaret had told me. Some people never learn that children require consistent support, not fluctuating attention based on the parent's circumstances, but I'd stopped worrying about David's choices. He'd made his bed with lies and selfishness, and now he had to sleep in it. My focus was entirely on Emma and the future we were building together, a future filled with honesty, security, and unconditional love. The baby book I'd been keeping for Emma now told a complete story, from the shocking discovery of her father's betrayal through the fight for justice to the peaceful life we'd created together. Someday, when she was old enough to understand, she'd know that her mother had never seen her as anything but a precious gift worth fighting for. As I settled into bed that night, Emma sleeping peacefully in the next room, I smiled thinking about all the birthdays to come. The first day of school, high school graduation, college, career achievements, maybe children of her own someday. Whatever the future held, Emma would face it knowing she was loved completely and unconditionally. David had tried to use our daughter as leverage in his selfish games, but Emma had become something much more powerful, the catalyst for her mother's transformation from victim to victor, from trusting wife to protective warrior. Sometimes the greatest betrayals lead to the most beautiful beginnings. Sometimes the worst thing that happens to you becomes the reason you discover strength. You never knew you had dots. Sometimes finding out your husband's dating profile is still active while you're 9 months pregnant is exactly the wake-up call you needed to build the life you and your daughter truly deserve. And sometimes justice isn't just about what you win in court. It's about who you become in the process of fighting for what's right.